Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let all attendees get logged in and join us, and then we'll get started. So we'll get going in 2 minutes from now. Thanks for your patience, everyone. We're just letting everyone get settled in now. So we'll just start in a minute or two from now. Okay, we'll just give it one more minute and then we'll get going. Okay, I think that's us ready to go now. Welcome everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Blundell. I'm the International Marketing Manager here at Premier Corex. Today we're presenting the first of our formation damage webinar series. What is formation damage and why should we care? Presented today by Justin Green. We obviously hope you'll get as much as you can from this webinar today. So if you have any questions during the presentation, just feel free to enter them into the Q&A in your Zoom panel below, and we can stop periodically to answer these for you. We're aiming for the presentation to last around 45 minutes today, and then we can also factor in some time at the end for further questions. So I will now pass you over to Justin Green, our presenter today. He can just quickly introduce himself and then he'll get us all started.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for coming today. Nice to speak to you this afternoon or morning, wherever you are. I'm speaking to you from my home in Aberdeen. We still have our lab open in Aberdeen, but as many people as possible are working from home to try and keep our social distancing in our lab. I'm part of the formation damage team at what many of you may have known as Corex in the past, now part of the Premier Oilfield Group. So the Premier Oilfield Group, we generate and analyze core and fluid data. That includes things like geochemistry, routine core analysis, special core analysis, PVT, organic geochemistry, EOR, and what I'm going to talk to you about today, formation damage. As I said, I'm speaking to you from Aberdeen. We also have offices in Houston, a couple of other places in Texas and Oklahoma in the USA, Cairo, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, and in Noida, which is near Delhi in India. So today our topic is information damage, and we've titled it, "What is information damage and why do we care?" And I think we're just going to try and have a broad overview and touch upon that and maybe generate some interest in that. So I'm going to kind of think about three things. Why should we care? And I'd like to make that argument from a technical and a financial viewpoint to you. What is it in terms of how do we define formation damage, and what does it look like in the reservoir? And I've got some examples of that. And then just the last section, I'd like to think about how do we look at it, thinking about testing and visualizations. And I can show you some examples of data and some examples of visualization as well. And as Jennifer said, if I see questions popping up, I'll pause for them now and again, and I'll pop back up at the end to answer some questions. So first up, and I think this is, broadly speaking, why are we even caring about this kind of thing? And this is a stat I like to look at. Now, this is for a hydraulic fracturing background. This survey was done, but I think this is extremely applicable to basically anything we do in this kind of core analysis, and especially formation damage EOR area of the industry. Is in these fractured wells, most common failures for jobs just not meeting expectations. You can see everything we expect to see, like the well placement, the reservoir quality itself, the frac design, the fluid design. They're all kind of minor or not as important things as understanding the reservoir itself. If we don't have a fundamental understanding of what our reservoir is, how it's going to interact with what we do, we're putting ourselves at high risk of having a failure in our job, our well, our drilling, our completion, our workover. So considering that it is the most common reason why wells fail, why doesn't everyone look at it all the time, and why should we care? So I said I'd talk about it from two different viewpoints. Why should we care? So the first one, I've tried to keep this kind of simple, just to illustrate why we should care on this. So this is a typical simplified graph of some formation damage test results. An undamaged case scenario, I've got this regained permeability here and lost permeability. With an undamaged reservoir, after we do a core flood study, we'd see 100%, nothing changed. And then in this example here, I've got 4 different drilling muds. Let's say they're 2 water-based, 2 oil-based, or maybe they're even variations within a single drilling mud, changing the bridging size, for example, or playing with different lubricants. And we can see there's a range of results here. Again, these are just examples, from a very minor reduction of 1%, building right up to 20% reduction in permeability. And 20% reduction in permeability, if I'm being honest, most of our clients who we work with would say that 20% is maybe not a good result, but an acceptable result. Most people think that 20% is something we could work with. So if we just went straight to looking at this 4th mud option, we'd say, okay, this is probably an acceptable drilling mud for my reservoir. But looking at the other ones in this example, we can half it, quarter it, or even go much further than that, just by doing a little bit of digging into why things have happened and is there a way of avoiding them. So from a technical point of view, doing our jobs as well as we can, generating as much information to help us make our decisions, and justifying our decisions are a really strong technical driver for looking at this subject, formation damage. And then for the bosses, the shareholders, money is always going to be the driver for this. So in the same scenario, I've just turned this into a simple bit of maths. Now, what I'm assuming here is that formation damage directly translates into lost production, which it doesn't. It might, but it probably doesn't. Either way, it should be illustrative of the kind of impact that we're talking about here. I've gone quite conservative with an example of a well or field, 1,000 barrels of oil per day, 300 days per year, 10 years. That equals 3 million barrels of oil. So we're not talking a gigantic mega field here. I'm not trying to wow you with numbers. This is like a relatively small scale, $75 million worth of oil. Now, superimposing that maths onto the muds that I looked at, again, we said that this is probably an acceptable result. The 20% damage has the potential to lose production of up to $15 million, with none damage being $75 million. So we've got this kind of green area here of lost permeability, lost production, where we stand to gain significant amounts of value in the well and recovery of production. Now, again, nobody's trying to say if you do formation damage testing, you make 15 million, 7 million, 3 million. But every pixel we can move this line to the right in a damage scenario, we're adding value to our well, we're making the economics more healthy. So trying to do our job as well as possible from a technical basis and making our wells more profitable and adding value to shareholders are probably the two drivers for these kind of studies that operators do, making sure we get things right before we make the mistakes in the field. And I only looked at lost production there, which is the middle here, but these are the kind of key things we should be thinking about in terms of the world of damage. If we can understand how reservoirs are behaving, how things can or have gone wrong, we can maximize initial damage when we're drilling a well or completing or doing a workover or bringing the well into injection. And by understanding it properly and avoiding it, we can save further costs because we can reduce the need for treatments if we can eliminate things before they happen. We can avoid recompletion, avoid having to drill additional wells. Lost production, if we can get production, generally speaking, earlier production is more efficient. So if we can get the highest possible initial rate, we don't really have to worry about what's happening later on. You know, EOR is being used increasingly in the oil and gas industry, but if we can get for production maximized early on, we might never need EOR. Shell and BP, they say that just purely by lost production from formation damage, this is a few years ago now, this quote, they were losing in excess of $1 billion each of production per year. They said this at a conference. So we're not talking small numbers in the formation damage world. And then the last one, which we don't think of so much, but is still relevant, is deferred production. If in my previous example, you say, no, we're not going to lose that production. It's just going to take longer because we're producing at 80% of the rate we're producing at. We increase our risk there. The financial risk, you know, if a well finished producing last year or stretched into the middle of this year, the oil that's being produced between the start of this year and the end of its lifetime is of lower value because we've stretched that into a low oil price environment. Same with facilities. The longer the facilities are going on, the higher the risk of facility issues and shutdowns go on. So this is what we should be thinking about in terms of why we should care about formation damage, kind of doing everything we can to give us the information that allows us to do things better. I said I was going to show you reservoir examples. So what's our prize? What are we talking about in the reservoir scale? This is a damaged well. This is an undamaged well. Same study. What we did here, this was purely looking at compatibility between completion fluid and the reservoir. This is a high rate gas reservoir. This is a type of electron microscope called a cryogenic scanning electron microscope. It allows us to look at fluids in situ in the reservoir. And so what we did was we introduced the completion fluid to the core sample at reservoir conditions. We let it soak in the sample, and then we started producing gas, flowing it through the sample, and then we measured the permeability, and we saw over 90% reduction in permeability. And when we looked inside the sample, we can see that where my pointer is now, this is a blocked pore, completely blocked throat. This is a pore throat that's significantly narrowed. It's because of this sea of fluid. The saturation had changed in the core sample. It wasn't incompatible, it was actually compatible. The native saturation to the formation brine was lower than the rock's preferred saturation to this brine, which happened to be KCl. So the chemistry of the completion brine was causing a saturation change in the reservoir. And as soon as we worked out that was what was causing the problem, you can work out, how do we fix that? Do we change the brine chemistry? That's one. Or do we look at a surfactant or a treatment? And that's what they did here. They looked at a solvent treatment, injected it after the completion, before production. And what that did was that broke the surface tension down, made the fluid more easy to remove. And this is the after picture, same study. You can see where we had tiny pores. Here we've got a nice big open pore. You can see the clay on the grain now, fantastic. It went from over 90% reduction in the left to less than 10%. It was about 5 or 6% reduction in the right. So simply by taking the approach of simulating, interpreting, making conclusions, we could identify a potential problem for the well before it ever happened. So this is our prize, avoiding having the panics or the damage in the well before it happens, or if something's happened unexpected in a well, simulate that and find out how we can fix it. So what is formation damage? I'm sure we've got a range of different people on this call who have a range of experience in formation damage, but I'm going to keep it simple. What do we call formation damage? Basically, anything we do to a reservoir that can impact, and it always is about money. Permeability is money, really. Anything that has an impact on production or injection, and that could be anything. The first, second that the drill bit enters the reservoir through drilling, completion, cleanup, workover, ejection, to the last drop of production or injection. Anything we do that takes the well away from ideal behavior. And that could be tons of things. I'm going to show you some examples, but these are the ones we see every day. You know, drilling mud. When we drill a reservoir in an open hole reservoir, the cleanup of the mud cake is key. How deep is the invasion if we're not going to perforate past it? That is key. Fluid. If we lose filtrate into the reservoir, does it come back out of the reservoir? Clay fines. We see clay fines in almost every clastic reservoir. Obviously, we're seeing different issues in unconventional reservoirs, in carbonate reservoirs, in clastic reservoirs. If we almost always see clay fines, we almost always have some potential for movement and accumulation. Incompatibility, we see this in all kinds of reservoirs. Is the fluid compatible with the rock? Is the fluid compatible with the native fluids? Do we see scales? Do we see emulsions forming? And then last up, something that we see very commonly, but kind of gets ignored a little bit, is bacterial byproducts. If we have sour oil, sour gas, we think of it as facilities, handling, topsides, financial problem because the oil's not as good or the gas isn't as good. Inside the reservoir, something is happening. And if that also means biopolymer, biofilm, and cells building up and restricting pores, that's a classic formation damage mechanism, even though it's to do with bacteria, not to do with drilling or completion. So these are kind of examples of typical damaging mechanisms we see in the reservoir. And the last one, before I show you some examples of what it looks like, is when does it impact on the life cycle of a well? You know, formation damage, a lot of people think formation damage is something that the guys who are developing the well, drillers, are thinking about. Development, when we look at choosing drilling mud, choosing completion fluid, choosing completion hardware, choosing the completion strategy, absolutely. You know, asking questions like, are the operational fluids correct for our reservoir? Can we avoid damage before we drill the reservoir? Can we do what we've done before, or do we need to do something different? Yes, that's probably where the majority of formation damage is done. But then let's think of it in early life, which people don't consider so often, in exploration and appraisal. If we have a disappointing result in an exploration or a appraisal well, was that well damaged while it was drilled? Was it a bad reservoir or a badly drilled reservoir? Does that poor well test indicate a poor well or indicate we have a damaged well? So if there's something we can do, if there's a tool, which I'm going to argue formation damage studies are as a tool, if we have a tool to put things in context, then we can start to understand better whether, yes, it was a bad well, it's a bad reservoir, this is not what we expected, or actually there's a lot of potential that can be unlocked from the reservoir at the exploration and appraisal stage. And then in production or injection, we're thinking about the same sort of things we're thinking of in the development world of, you know, drilling completion damage. Do we need to avoid that? Can we minimize that? But we can also ask things like, does damage change with time? Because drilling and completion damage should clean up to give us a benefit. Does it? Or what happens if production damage or injection damage is happening? Are we seeing fines migration? Are we seeing scaling? Are we seeing water breakthrough causing damage? If we can identify that, we can maybe find out what the best treatments are. And then really importantly, do the treatments have side effects? It's all very well saying we have a magic bullet, but what happens if that magic bullet has a side effect? A great example of that is if we see drilling damage. Well, it's very common. If it's calcium carbonate, calcite drilling mud, let's use some acid to dissolve the drilling mud damage. But then if we have clays, for example, chlorite in the reservoir, they're very acid sensitive, and we could actually introduce new damage by trying to fix the damage we see. So understanding that in the workover stage or the late life stage is another use of formation damage studies as a tool to try and understand what's happening. So now down to the kind of reservoir and pore level. What does it look like in the reservoir? You know, that's the theory of why we do it. What does it actually look like to us? So I've got 2 or 3 examples of different stages in the well where I'm going to show you what formation damage looks like at a pore level. So here we are, I've got some drilling examples here. So I've got a thin section, I've got an electron microscope image, and I've got some actual core photographs. So the kind of stuff that you know, what damage looks like is, this is a reservoir. Blue is pores, white is the grains. This is a cross section. This is the inlet face, the wellbore. and downwards is a cross section into it. What we're seeing here is this grey area is actually the drilling mud cake that hasn't cleaned up during production. So we've got blue pores open, just a couple of pores into the reservoir, but in this open hole reservoir scenario, the mud cake is blocking pores and stopping flow. So this was a highly damaging drilling mud on a very narrow layer of damage. This is the same sample, looking at it from an electron microscope, zoomed right into the reservoir. Here, imagine you're sitting in the reservoir and we're looking towards the wellbore. The wellbore is what we're looking at here at 100 times magnification. So we can see grains. This is the grains of the reservoir. The black spaces are pores, and we can see grains, but then there's a coating of these kind of blocky solids all over it, and you can see they're blocking off these pores. This is remnants of the drilling mud. So the drilling mud, when the well was drilled, built up a mud cake, as it should do. And then when we produced, which was coming towards us production in this well, it only cleaned up some areas. It cleaned up these kind of channels between these grains. You can see channels here in the mud. There's channels and porosity. There is some permeability here, but a lot of the pores are blocked. So there's a really high potential for damage. Or looking at the flip side of that, there's actually an opportunity to improve recovery by either redesigning the mud so that it's more easy to remove or lift off, if you want to use that terminology, or looking at a treatment to target these specific solids here. If they're calcium carbonate, which they are, we can dissolve them away before they ever become a problem. You know, and sometimes you think the answers are obvious when you actually do a study, but if we don't have a study, we don't have the obvious answers. This is, again, real field data. This is published. This is from a Norwegian field, and what we see here is the same reservoir which had an oil and gas leg, and we tested two drilling muds. Drilling mud 1 is oil-based mud, drilling mud 2 is water-based mud. So if I focus on the gas leg, the left-hand image was a good result, the right-hand image was not so good, and it should be, you know, apparent, fairly obviously why that was. When we tested the two drilling muds under exactly the same conditions, same scenario, what happened was, with the oil-based mud, we were opening up lots of channels, lots of wormholes through the drilling mud. Basically, the mud cake was becoming a non-barrier to flow. Whereas in the middle one here, where we have water-based mud, you can see we've only got a handful of these large channels open, and so large areas of the rock face, like we're seeing here, were blocked off from flow. So, you know, simple things like testing different muds and seeing what impact they have on our specific reservoir, because this might be a completely different result if we had different pore size, different pore shape, different viscosity of reservoir fluid. They all impact on the results. So this is what drilling related damage looks like at a reservoir level. Completion related damage at a reservoir level, I've showed you the image here. So this is, you know, fluid phase entrapment, saturation change from completion fluid. Here we have what you want to call a water block. This is an oil reservoir. So this is another cryogenic SEM image. Here I have a grain. Here I have a grain, and there's another grain popping in here. So somewhere at the bottom left, there's a pore throat, and somewhere up here, there's a pore throat. Our pore is full of oil here. But what we also have are these spheres inside the pore. This is the completion fluid that's got into the pore network, and in the near wellbore has formed a very stable emulsion and blocked off the near wellbore. And what we actually have here, these stripy areas, are single droplets of the completion brine which have got trapped. Production is in this direction from northeast to southwest, and it's got blocked in the pore throat because the rate of production wasn't enough to breach the pressure needed to pop that fluid through and out of the pore. So again, if we know that's happened, we know that we've got damage there. How do we fix that? We can look at surfactants, we can look at changing the chemistry. I'm just going to pause for a second. We had a question here from Rehan, who's asking, how do we identify the formation damage as early as possible? By what means other than testing? So obviously we're coming at it from a testing perspective here. How do we identify damage? Well, I suppose identifying damage in exploration and appraisal wells is difficult unless we know exactly how we expect them to behave. And then we've got at least a kind of delta in expectation that we can use to indicate something has gone wrong to do that. In wells where we have a baseline to look at, so for example, if we have a well where we have an initial production and we see the production declining or going up, we can understand that damage is potentially happening. So we can look at production rate, production pressure, injection rate. We can look at Another indication that we might have damage is where we see high losses, high fluid losses into a formation, because that's quite often associated with high levels of damage. So anything that doesn't work as it's supposed to can be an indication that it's damage, and also anything that is away from our expectation. I suppose that's where the world of skin comes in, with predicted flow versus actual flow, letting us know where there's potential damage. If we see what we think is skin, then we might see damage. Hopefully that answered your question there. And just the last thing on completion damage is looking at screens and hardware. You can see here we have the same reservoir with a weave screen and a wire wrap screen, and we can see that sand is being produced and held back by the screen here and blocking up some of the apertures, more of them in the weave screen than the wire wrap screen. We can actually even see this is a kind of footprint of gravel pack. When we've removed the gravel pack from the reservoir, beneath it we can see the reservoir itself. And trapped behind the gravel was the mud cake. This kind of thin layer with holes in it is actually the mud cake that didn't clean up because the gravel pack sizing was too fine. And so that sort of information allowed us to see that. Is buildup of mud cake during drilling considered formation damage from Sultan? Absolutely. Yes and no, because a mud cake has to build up during drilling of a reservoir. We need to control losses, we need to control pressures, we need to make sure we're safely drilling the reservoir. So we need a drilling mud cake during production. But what we need is a drilling mud cake that will be cleaned up during production or injection. So buildup of a mud cake is a good thing. Buildup of a mud cake that won't clean up or won't be removed during production is a bad thing. And that's the very aim of what we look at in formation damage, Sultan. And a couple of other examples of what damage looks like in a reservoir. I've got this is, emulsions, incompatibility, sludges, I've showed you that already. Scaling. This is a carbonate scale. This is caused simply by the reservoir pressure depleting with a formation brine that had a high tendency for carbonate scaling. And I would say, look at the grains here, but you can't really see the grains. It looks like everything's coated with sugar. The small cubic grains in there that are a few microns across are actually calcium carbonate scale. And that's just from a differential pressure. As the reservoir pressure depletes, scale started to be produced. That's not from water breakthrough. That's not from water injection. That's native scaling. And that's quite a severe issue there. But this does happen in reservoirs, and it happens compatibility wise as well. One more example I want to show you is clay fines migration. We always talk about clay fines, and everyone thinks, well, let's just put potassium chloride. If we have clay, let's put potassium chloride in our fluids. That stops clay. Potassium chloride targets a specific type of clay called smectite and similar clays that swells in contact with fluids. It doesn't target clay fines migration at all. And you can see why, just by using a chemical additive, it doesn't reduce the risk of formation damage. Here's a clastic reservoir. These are grains. This is the quartz grains in the reservoir here. We're in a pore. So you can see I've marked the inlet and outlet of this pore here. So you can see a pore through it here. There's one here, and there's one up here in the top of the pore. And inside the pore, we have lots of this kaolinite clay just sitting in a really vulnerable place here. So we can see stacks of these kaolinite plates. And as we flow past them, we could have a chemical reaction with the fluid that's flowing past. And we could also have a physical reaction with them. Imagine blasting that like with a hose. If you dribble the hose at a low rate onto these things, you're not going to break them up. But as we start to increase the rate of the hose, or put our finger on the end of the hose as we blast onto these, they're going to start to become disaggregated. And you can see the size of some of these plates is not much smaller than the pore throats. So it's relatively easy to start building them up and blocking pores. So clay fines migration is an extremely common thing to see in all reservoirs, and it can be a minor problem or no problem because they might get picked up, flow away with production or injection, or it can become a major problem where you don't even need to move more than a few tens of microns. If this clay plate here moves to this pore throat here, and these three ones here move up here to this pore throat, we can seal off this pore without these clays having moved more than a few hundred microns, and we'd never detect the clays getting out of the reservoir. So Rohan's asked, can we say the reason behind formation damage is due to completion is purely because of poor selection of completion fluid? No, we can have other types of damage. So, for example, we can have damage during perforation. We can have losses, and the rate of losses, the rate of surges during perforation can cause damage from clay fines. Like here, you imagine we suddenly initiate flow through these in an underbalanced perf. We can have damage there. The hardware can cause damage if the mud doesn't flow back through the hardware, or or the fluids and the sand get blocked behind the hardware, then we've got an issue there. And I think a poor completion fluid selection can, but then it's not always poor completion fluid selection. It's sometimes the reservoir having a specific sensitivity that we don't understand or didn't expect. That's why we do these kind of studies. You know, best practice for a region might be a specific type of drilling or completion fluid. Best practice for your reservoir might be slightly different. So I want to move on from showing some examples of damage to showing how we look at it. And I think if we accept there's a lot of different mechanisms, and I've only showed you a little handful of them. There's a whole different webinar we could be doing on formation damage mechanisms, how they affect the reservoir, what part in a well life they do. But if you accept from the pictures I've shown that there's a load of things that can go wrong during the life of a well, then we should be starting to think to ourselves, what do we need to know to avoid that? And this is, I think there's 3 questions that are key for us here. What has happened or what might happen? Where has it happened or where might it happen? And why has it happened? And if we can answer any one of these, we're starting to get better information. If we can answer all 3 of these, we're in quite a strong position. And so the approach that I'm going to argue, and I'm not going to go into detail today because we're just talking about it in a kind of overview, is quite simple. It's 2 steps: simulate and interpret. So obviously, Premier Oilfield Group, Corex, we're a lab services company predominantly. So of course, we're going to be advocating lab simulations. But simulating, understanding what's happening, understanding as closely as possible to well scenarios to answer these what questions with data like, how does the permeability of the reservoir change? What does filtrate loss mean in the reservoir? What's the pressures and rates during production? Photography, what does the reservoir, I showed you the pictures of the 2 different muds. We could straight away see what the difference was as soon as that sample came out of our core holder. Where is the damage? I'm going to show you an example of a technique we've developed called 3D alteration modeling that lets us visualize the damage in the near wellbore. And then last up, I'm just going to give you an example of tying back traditional geological techniques to zoom right in to the pore level and say why things have happened. So if we can answer these, we're in a really strong position. So I'm just going to briefly talk you through them. So the what, as I said, the what has happened is through things like permeability measurements and core flood testing, more or less. So I'm just going to show you a bit example of a bit of equipment. Reservoir condition simulator. Now, Pedram has asked about information about gelation damage that usually happens in unconventionals. I think that one is going to be more related to we have Frank Zamora, who's our fluids team leader. So I'm going to let Frank Zamora, you've asked that question, Pedram, we've got your details, and yes, we can give you some more information about that. I'm not going to cover it today in this formation damage one, but I totally agree it's damage though. Core flood testing, reservoir condition simulator. There's lots of these available in industry. These are ones we design in-house. Other people have slightly different designs. But generally speaking, what we're trying to do in studies is take a piece of real reservoir core, if possible. If not, do we have analog core or outcrop core? Put it in a core holder, prepare it back to the initial reservoir conditions, oil leg, gas leg, water leg, aquifer, whatever we're looking at here, in a core holder. Everything inside this oven, reservoir temperature, everything pressurized to reservoir pressure, and then simulate what we plan to do on a well or what we have done in a well, step by step in the lab, measuring permeability, virgin permeability. Let's drill the well. Let's displace that with a completion fluid. Let's let that completion fluid sit there for a little while. Then let's bring the well into production of oil or gas, measure permeability. This side is our reservoir side where we can use gas, humidified gas. For oil reservoirs, we can have hot oil or room temperature oil, depending on the oil properties, to flow the production direction of this side. And here in these kind of rigs, you can look at, there's a couple of these pressure vessels here, which hold a couple of liters of fluid. And there's actually 2, one behind the other here. So we can displace fluids through cores at overbalance pressure, past the face of the core, bullhead, squeeze, overbalance. So we can simulate a range of conditions, displacing past the face at higher rate, cold tubing jetting into the face of the core, squeezing in at a gentle rate. So copy what happens in the well, measure permeability, measure filtrate loss, measure the breakthrough time, for example. If we have a mud breaker and we have a breaker there, we can have that sitting at overbalance pressure, waiting to see how long it takes to break through. And when we start to see breakthrough, jumping up to high rates. So simulate the well, measure, take as much data during that as possible. And that lets us look at, output data, things like this. So permeability data. This is real data published again in an SP paper a couple of years ago. Some real data looking at two different formations, 3 different mud formulations. And I said at the start, I had 80% as my conserved, for example. This is the red line I'm looking at here, which is after production part of the simulation. This study, every single result was under 80%. So when I was saying small differences in damage can have a big impact, I wasn't exaggerating. This is real, published, well data, and everything is in the 50 to 75% range of production. So I was being quite conservative in my numbers. But having said that, let's, what kind of information did we get from this? We looked at these 3 different mud formulations, and first thing we could do quite rapidly is say, well, let's look at this lithology 2 here. We can see that we've got this formulation C, formulation B, and formulation A. Well, A and B are performing a bit better. C is a little bit worse. Comparing it in this rock type 1, we've got formulation C performing worse, and we've got formulations B and A performing very similarly. So I think we can eliminate formulation C, that mud's gone. And then we can start to say, yeah, if we just looked at one rock type, we'd say there's not much difference between them. But then if we look at both rock types combined, formulation B there's a gap there again, 10, 15%. So as I said, a couple of percent here and there of damage can make quite a difference in permeability. So here we eliminated formulation C quite early on. And then here we've got a better result with formulation A and formulation B. So there's a formulation to choose, looking at things properly, looking into them in a bit of detail. And there's a lot more interpretation from this image, but I'm not really going to talk through that in this presentation. But Perm can tell us really good stuff. Visual images, as I showed you earlier on, looking at one mud versus another mud, oil versus gas leg, like there was in this reservoir. Let's see why the cleanup happened, how it was different. Visual observations were very important. So Perm, visual observations, production rate, loss data. I don't have that all here in this presentation. Again, this is another one. So someone's asked, what is after spin down? So I'm just going to pop back that slide. So it's spin down. So in this study, this was a simple open hole case where we built up a mud cake, produced back through it, measured permeability, which is what the red blocks are here. Then we took off any external mud cake, which is what this blue block is. So I can actually say, we can make interpretation. In formulation A, we only saw a small increase in perm when we removed the mud cake. So the mud cake wasn't really causing any damage. In formulation B with the same rock type, there was a big blue block comparing this to this, which means the mud cake was more damaging there. At the end point they got was the same thing, but during early production, we'd expect this mud to be more damaging to the reservoir than this one. So that told us some more information. The last bit of information we could tell is what we call spin down, where we centrifuge the cores at the end of the study, and centrifuging the core removes any mobile fluid that was, say, for example, trapped by a mud cake, or the sweep was incomplete through the core sample. So let's just look at the best case, long-term, irreducible damage, if you like. So we can see if there's a gap between here or a gap between here and here, here's our potential to improve it. Because, with given enough time, you'd hope you're going to reach this endpoint. But this is the early production point of view. So if we know that there's a 20% potential improvement here, by identifying what's causing this damage, we can hopefully bring the red line right up here to the right. So the spin down is something we do in the lab, which is a lab only measurement that you can't centrifuge the field, but the lab we can do it and it gives us some really good data. So that was the kind of stuff we do broadly speaking in core flood testing. And again, it's a whole separate webinar is how do we do core flood and what does data look like? But I want to move on to the partner of that, which is the where and the why, which is the where is the damage and why do we see damage? So we have here that I want to show first is the where, which is what a technique we've developed called 3D alteration modeling. If anyone's interested in this, we've written a couple of papers on this technique, which you can look up on SPE, search for Corex, search for my name, and you'll see these papers here. And this is a technique we developed using high resolution CT scanning to allow us to scan the entire core sample before and after a study. So we have the sample at its initial baseline conditions. And what we did was we took 1,000 scans each in the X, Y, and Z planes, gives us 3,000 scans, data set at sub 10 micron resolution, a few microns resolution, a data set of 15 gigabytes here. And then we've done the same thing at the end point of the study. And we have scanned it after the production period. And this was a drilling mud test. I'm showing lots of drilling mud examples because they're very visual, but this approach is applicable to carbonates, to fluids, not just to drilling. I'm just showing you drilling. And you know, when we took the sample out, we could see there was a drilling mud, and the CT scan showed that. But what's happening inside the sample? This is where the depth of invasion is important, the modeling is important. What we do is we use computationally, we take these two data sets, 15 gigabyte huge data sets, overlay them on top of each other, line them up perfectly grain to grain computationally, and then we run an algorithm on every single point where the data intersects, which is 300 million points in a typical sample. And every single point where that data intersects, we say, are you the same? And this is a CT scan, so it's by CT density or X-ray density. So where the density is the same, the grain hasn't changed, it may make it go invisible, which is why most of this right-hand image is white and invisible. But then everywhere there's a change, be that positive because something's appeared there, or be that negative because something's been removed, we make an intensity measurement of how big the change is. And what you can see here is you can see now the sample's disappeared. We're essentially looking at a map in the reservoir of where the damage is in this sample. Core plug sample, here's the wellbore. We can see there's an external drilling mud cake that hasn't cleaned up, an internal mud cake, an internal filter cake that hasn't cleaned up fully during production. So most of our damage here is just at the interface between the reservoir and the mud cake. So, you know, the mud cleanup damage is most significant here, although we are seeing some invasion into the sample. We're seeing some pores, individual pores that are changing here. What we can't do with the CT scan is answer exactly what they are. What we do with this is then use this data to kind of tell us where to zoom into. So we're obviously going to look at some imagery around here. We're going to look at some of these areas here to try and understand what has caused those changes, things like electron microscope and thin section and X-ray diffraction. But this is an extremely useful thing for visualizing. Do we have shallow damage? Do we have deep damage? Do we have damage that's along certain layers in the reservoir? Is it worse in one rock type than another rock type? So I have someone's asked a question, in reality of operations, what kind of operation or treatment is used to remove, it says make, I presume cake. If we're talking about drilling mud cake, the kind of operation or treatment we could, well, obviously perforation is going to bypass that, so we don't have to worry about that one. But in terms of treatment fluid, we could be looking at acid, we could be looking at enzyme or breakers, acid generating enzymes. We could be looking at fluids designed to flow the mud away. There's lots of things to look at drilling mud damage. I just want to show you another example of using visualizations. This is I've been mostly showing you clastic reservoirs. Here's a carbonate reservoir where there was a perforation pill tested. And so we did 2 rounds of testing. The orange is what we call positive change, so damage, where something's appeared or it wasn't there before. So here's 4 separate samples where the perforation pill was causing quite big drops in permeability, 50 to 70%, because it was blocking off the perforation walls, which is this face represents. You can see the cake there after perforation and drawdown still remained. This went a bit deep into the formation cakes. So the operator decided what they wanted to do was look at a treatment fluid for that. And it happened it was an acid treatment, and it was a carbonate reservoir. So what they wanted to do was remove the perforation pill damage and hopefully also stimulate in the near wellbore. And looking at, this is round 1 of testing. Round 2 of testing used the acid, and by using the visualization technique, we could actually map where the damage or removal of damage was. And what we saw was all the external damage and internal damage from the pills just disappeared 100% completely. The cake removal was extremely successful. But what happened was, because it was quite a strong acid, there was 3 different acid treatments used. They had slightly different impacts on the reservoir. So here you can see we removed all the external. We started to do a very near wellbore dissolution of grains and cement, and then some kind of wormholes went into the rock, but didn't go the entire way through it. Some dissolution at this face with the effluent. This one, we removed all the near wellbore damage, and then what happened was it broke through very quickly, because this was the strongest level of the acid. Broke through very quickly, 1 channel through the sample, and this just dissolved, ate away at the end of the sample. So basically, we had a stimulation of 1 channel only. This one, which was the best result, is you see these lovely wormholes, these kind of dendritic type wormholes they're called, where we ate away the mud cake, then had a wonderful kind of high surface area stimulation in the near wellbore. So we could see the perm results changing. The SEM showed us we went from these kind of low permeability, low porosity to these huge channels open. This is one of these channels here open in the wellbore. And then the visualization technique showed us where it actually had its impact in the reservoir, and allowed the operator to choose, do we want a slower acting one? Do we want a faster acting one? What do we want to happen? So it gives us this kind of information. There's a long question there about limestone, so I'll come back to that at the end and read it when we're waiting for some questions at the end. So that's Mohammed. I'll come back to you at the end on that one, because I've only got a couple more slides really to go now on this. Another thing we can do with the visualization technique is understand unusual behavior. So this is a sort of low to moderate perm sandstone. And this is the unusual behavior. This graph here, this is a drilling mud filtrate loss graph. This is, the actual overall shape of the graph is nothing, this is a water-based mud, fairly normal shape of the graph here. But what we saw was this early part here, which is the spurt loss as the mud cake was initially building up, is a lot steeper and higher than normal. I maybe expect this graph to start leveling off around here or somewhere. So the spurt loss was higher than expected. And when we see that kind of data, traditionally using just raw lab data, we'd say something's wrong with the bridging. We don't know what's wrong with the bridging. But now, because we have these mapping techniques, we can start to look and get a slightly better answer on that. So this is the sample after the study. And what we can see is there was some mud cake left at the end there. But inside the sample, what we can actually see is there's this like zone here where we're seeing lots of change in here. And we see these stripes here. It's very unusual. So we wondered what that was. And then we went and looked at the raw scans of the sample before the study. And when we cut a slice through here, what we could see is that these zones here, 1, 2, 3, and sort of a fourth one here, were lined up perfectly with these sort of streaks or zones where you can see in this CT scan, gray is grains and black is pores. And you can see this is kind of low porosity, low, but these areas with more black, larger speckles are higher porosity. So what actually happened was the drilling mud was sized for the average pore throat of the reservoir, but the maximum pore throat was much bigger than the average pore throat. And so you blocked off well against the average pore throat size. But on these high perm streaks, mud kind of just shot down them. Solids went down there, fluid went down there. And when we came onto production, the production kind of bypassed this zone, just went straight up this low invasion zone, flowed from here. And then the high perm streaks were completely cut off from production. This is a really bad result for the reservoir that was only really indicated by the fluid loss, but in the real life, these may never clean up these zones. So we needed to think about changing the bridging in particular for this. We might have to compromise on the average pore throat, getting us, not bridging for that, bridging for a slightly larger pore throat and giving a mud that was less damaging to that pore size. So understanding unusual behavior is something that is really valuable to get from this kind of test data. And then last up, just integrating everything together. So I'm not going to, again, this isn't a lecture on geological techniques. I said that the why, zooming into these points in the 3D alteration map, if we can see where the damage is, we can zoom in on that. So we have here an electron microscope image of this area here. And what we can actually see, a lot of the pores are blocked off by drilling mud sods. We then went into this zone inside here and used a chemical scan, and it showed us with this EDS, which is a part of the electron microscope, showed us we were seeing components of the drilling mud brine, base brine basically. So the drilling mud filtrate was going into the near wellbore and was getting stuck in there. We could see at the actual face with the CT scan, we could actually see the mud cake was kind of breaking down and becoming more heterogeneous with time, which was quite bad for the cleanup of the mud cake. And then deeper into the rock, we wanted to see what all these patches of dots were. And when we zoomed in with the electron microscope, we saw it was clay fines redistribution. So the clays were moving around in the pores and blocking off some pores. And that's what these white dots represent, pores that were blocked off or at least reduced by the clay fines migration. So in this particular well, we could then, the three questions I said, what has happened, where has it happened, and why has it happened? What has happened? We lost permeability. Let's just say it was 35% here. Where did it happen? Well, we had a zone at the wellbore of the reservoir where we saw that the damage was caused by drilling mud cleanup issues. Slightly deeper into the reservoir, a few millimeters in, we saw fluid retention from the filtrates getting stuck behind the mud cake. And then deeper into the reservoir, we saw clay fines migration. So what can we actually do to fix that in real life? And the fines migration is a difficult one, and that's a subject for another day again. But this is something we can fix quite easily here. We can think about, can we limit invasion? Can we make a mud cake that's more easy to remove? Or can we think about treatment? So what has happened? Where has it happened? Why has it happened? We've answered those questions, and we can start to make some actual real recommendations and conclusions on that. And then we want to go and look and test the solutions that are being found to them. One last slide I want to show you is, where is this going? Because I showed you this technique here, which is qualitative. Where it's going, in the next few years, watch out for this. This is a patent we've received for quantification of damage. So we've again, this is for another day. We have a whole webinar on visualization of damage, which is coming up in a few weeks' time if you're interested. And this is looking at, we've developed a technique for scanning at multiple resolutions using multiple different techniques before and after testing. And this is real data where we can actually scan and segregate individual damaging mechanisms out. So in this particular cube of rock, which is real core flood test data, we can actually see that 31 permeability reduction. And we can actually quantify individual damaging mechanisms and see that the drilling mud filtrate in this particular case was causing about 3/4 of the damage. So this kind of quantification is a kind of holy grail in the world of formation damage. This is where we're going, is full quantification of damage, and therefore hopefully using this data to upscale to reservoir level, to well level, to field level, to fill in that gap between the pore scale, which is the formation damage world, and the field scale and well and inflow models and production models, which is what in the end we're really most concerned about. So this is where we're going. But you know what we're doing, what is being done in the industry all day, every day is this kind of what, where, why approach with a qualitative answer. So just back to the very start before we finish is why should we care? Hopefully I've answered some of those questions. Why should we care? So first thing is in terms of doing our job properly and adding value to our well, what formation damage does, or the study of formation damage does, is target these blocks here on the right: the damage, the lost permeability, the lost production, the lost money. And if we can take a little bit of time and money, of course I come at from a lab point of view to say, of course we should spend a bit of time and money to study this. That's a difficult thing to justify in the current industry environment. But even with $25 oil, like I have in this example here, moving the needle 1% can make big leaps. Moving the needle 1% in this example is $750,000. I don't need to promise you I'm going to move the needle 1%. If we have the potential of moving it a few percent, we have the potential of having a good result. So we just have to want to make better choices and have good information to make good choices. And that's, core level, real rock, real simulations. If we can kind of leverage that information to help us make better field choices, everyone's going to be in a much stronger position. If we have core, if we have analog core, why not use that? We've already cut it. We need to spend a bit more money doing a lab study, but it can give us really good data. So hopefully today I've managed to answer, the question at the start, why should we care? Of course, I'm a formation damage guy. We've got to care about this, but it's kind of basic logic that we should be thinking about it in a field scenario to make sure we make the best decisions before we make them. Or if it's too late, why things have gone wrong, use it as a diagnostic tool. So that's really what I wanted to show today. I see there's a few questions coming. I'm just going to scroll through them in a second. Please feel free to type any more questions just now. So I'm just going to turn my camera back on so you can see my face while I'm answering the questions. I'm going to have a look at a couple of the questions just now. If you've got any more ones, please jump in. Otherwise, I encourage you to contact Jennifer or myself, whose details are there. On our socials, we have stuff there. So let me have a look at a couple of questions here. We have a question about nodular limestone from Mohammed, saying in nodular limestone and marls, fractures perpendicular to the bedding, nodules are detached and vacant space exists between them. So such features, intensely fractured nodular limestones, can lead to formation damage in the subsurface. If you know of any such examples from oil and gas field of the world, mention it, please. That's a really good question, actually. I don't have an example off the top of my head. I'm going to ask Jennifer to save this one, and Mohammed, we're going to have a look at that and come back to you on that one. If we've got some examples, we're going to come back to you. Pedram, can you please share some results showing comparable observations from lab scale to field scale? That's actually a really interesting question as well, because we actually don't get given field scale data very often. We'd love it. We'd love if we were able to publish a paper after every study we do saying this is what we did in the lab and this is what the field scale result of that exact decision, and that was the impact of the decision that was made. If you search through our publications on SPE, there's a number of them we've co-authored with operators, and some of them, the operators have made comments on how the data was used at the field scale, and a couple of them have made specific comments. So for example, I can think of one that we did with British Gas BG Group, which is now a Shell operated subsidiary, which is now part of Shell. And that was the example I showed at the start of the presentation with the filtrate getting stuck in the reservoir. And they said that we went from an unacceptable level of damage to having their best performing well in the South North Sea, this particular was. So some of our papers touch upon that. So look for papers in SP with our name that are co-authored with operators, and they'll tend to touch upon that as well. So there's a few with BG, there's some BP ones. We have a recent paper with Aker BP, and we have a couple that either have been authored by Equinor or co-authored by us that have some field scale examples of that. And they also include some simulations. So I can think of a paper from Equinor in the last couple of years that actually has some simulations there as well. Oh yeah, good question from about sand production here. So what about sand production? Can it be simulated and find the best practice to mitigate? 100%. So another one to watch out for is we're going to be doing a webinar on sand control alone, because it's a whole separate subject. Sand control, we have to predict whether it will happen, under what circumstances it will happen. Once we know it's going to happen, we need to think about the best sand control hardware or the best sand control treatment, or how we avoid sanding having an impact on productivity, or making sure the right hardware is used. So yeah, that's a great question, and it's a whole subject of its own. But it gets looked at in core flood testing. It gets looked at in sand control type testing as well. Another question here. How far can a drilling fluid spread is filtrate from wellbore to reservoir, and can perforations relieve that blockage? Another excellent question. So I'm going to give an answer that I sometimes give, which people hate me giving, which is it depends. So the depth of invasion depends on a lot of things, but some of the key things are the reservoir, so the permeability and pore throat size of the reservoir, the viscosity of the reservoir fluid, the pressure in the reservoir, and then from the fluid we're introducing, the size of the solids in the drilling mud, the overbalance of the drilling mud, the chemistry, the viscosity of the drilling mud filtrate as well. So they can all make a difference. So we could see invasion ranging from basically zero invasion. We can have very often, we can have a drilling mud that has little or no invasion. And then the extreme end of the scale is where there's very poor filtrate loss control, where we can have very deep invasion. You know, like it would be feet into the reservoir. And we have seen very severe results like that in a range of permeability types. And so therefore, will a perforation relieve that blockage? Another answer you'll hate, maybe. Because if it's shallow damage, shallow invasion, if we can bypass that, perfect. If we can't bypass that, then we've got a problem. And that's why we need to consider a range of things. So if we think about intercased and perforated reservoir, we need to think about the virgin zone, the invaded zone for different levels of damage. Question here on, do we have examples of damage due to asphaltene deposition from Leila, sorry. Absolutely we do. There's going to be some EOR ones in our series of webinars as well. And I have an example. So Jennifer, if you keep Leila's information, I actually have a picture I can show you of asphaltene deposition that we have from a formation damage carbon dioxide study actually. What have we got? A couple more questions here. So that's Alan Twyman. Hello, Alan. Nice to see you on the seminar, asking about the micro-CT. Saying it's still only valuable on field core, not outcrop core. What percentage of your core flood testing with drilling fluids utilize micro-CT? So yeah, micro-CT kind of came from nowhere, if you like. So it's only been really used at this level since about 2010, 2011. And since 2012, we've been doing a lot of it. And I think depending on what the aim of the study is, how many fluids we're testing, whether we're doing fines migration, for example, we do less CT scanning. But with drilling fluid studies, you know, some operators who are doing things, you know, I'm going to say properly because of course I am, will look at micro CT scanning on every single sample. Some operators will pick, you know, they'll do some initial mud screening and then pick candidate muds that go onto the more advanced testing. But the percentage of studies that we do micro CT scanning on, it has increased and it's built up to, you know, it could be half or more studies now. You know, we've got a really good database of this building up now. It's allowed us to develop some of these new techniques, Alan. On the question of is it only valuable on reservoir core and outcrop core, again, that's probably another hour conversation for us to have. I think there's some really valuable stuff that can be got from outcrop core. However, you're always going to want to do it on reservoir core if you can. You'll know yourself from your old company BP, a lot of their studies are done on outcrop core rather than reservoir core. Michael asking about Premier done much work on formation damage specific to shale, ultra low permeability. Absolutely. It tends to be a slightly different angle than I've come at today, but we tend to be looking at fractures, fracture conductivity, the fluids, the proppant, things like that. 100% they are. And so, Michael, I think that, again, we're taking a note of all these. There's some good stuff that we might be able to share from our team across in Houston with you on that. Frank and his team on the fluid side have got really good stuff in the formation damage world on a shale and ultra-low permeability. And in the conventional world, we do deal with ultra low perm, North Sea, Middle East, we're talking fractions of a millidarcy permeability as well. I'm going to wrap up now because I see we've hit the end of our hour. I see one more question here. To remove formation damage, the stimulation, the question is which stimulation method to select? It depends on formation damage type only. Acidizing or hydraulic fracturing depends on formation damage magnitude. That's from Rohan. You've just given me a really nice point to jump off because I 100% agree with you on this one. Yeah, to remove damage properly, we have to know why the damage has happened. Because we could take a guess, our well's not performed. Should we throw some acid down the well? Shall we fracture the well? Shall we look at a water wash to try and remove scale? We don't know until we understand what the damage is. So thank you very much, Rohan, for asking that question because it kind of sums up very nicely what I wanted to say. Hopefully the more information you get, the better your treatment selection is going to be. So I 100% agree with you on that, Rohan. So thanks very much everyone for their time. Jennifer, I think you have a couple of words at the end. So thank you for your time and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, and just a big thank you for everybody for attending and spending their time with us today. We will get the link for the webinar recording sent out shortly. I know there was a few questions during the presentation about access to the slides, etc. So yeah, no problem. Also, please keep a lookout for more of our formation damage webinars. They will be coming in the next few weeks. We'll be scheduling them shortly, and we'll be also kicking off our core analysis and EOR webinar series presented by Jules Reed. So take a look out for them, and more information will be available on our social media outlets. Similarly as well, if you do have any topics you'd like to see added to the schedule, we'd be more than happy to cater for anything specific that you would like to see. So yeah, just get in touch and we can work out the details. Thank you very much everybody again, and we hope to see you next time.